Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So at long last, we have the secret for church growth, guaranteed by the biblical writers. And it's simple. All you need to do is sell all your things and share everything in common. I suggest we all live in Gene Hillis's former place, where I'm living now. For sleeping, we'll have to be stacked up like cordwood, but the view is to die for. Of course, I'm making fun, but I never want to discount any passage from the Bible just out of hand, because I'm always nervous with how easily some people reject teachings from Jesus because they just aren't practical or realistic. Things like forgiving all offenses, sharing your possessions with others, turning the other cheek, forgiving debts, stuff like that. No, don't get me wrong. We do have to take realism into account. But we should never just toss something out because it seems too hard. But as you can imagine, many different groups within Christianity throughout our history have tried to live according to the church model provided in Acts 2. That's where the inspiration for certain Catholic orders come from, with members effectively owning nothing. But I digress. This Sunday, the fourth Sunday of Easter, is referred to as Good Shepherd Sunday, because the gospel reading always comes from John 10, where Jesus talks about himself as the Good Shepherd. And of course, our psalm for today was Psalm 23. A reading from 1 Peter references sheep and Christ as the shepherd. And although the reading from Acts doesn't mention either, but it does talk about life in community, which you can liken to the flock of sheep. As I embark on this message, first, a question. How many of you heard a sermon on these passages where you're told how dumb sheep are and how dependent they are on the shepherd? I'm expecting more than that, come on. It doesn't work very well rhetorically if you don't do that. But anyway. And then, of course, the preacher what does? Extends that metaphor to us, right? And says, oh, we're so dependent on Christ. And kind of dumb by extension. And you know what? I am guilty for delivering such a sermon. Probably more times than I care to admit. But today I'm going to try to see this passage a little bit differently. Especially since so many people have already heard that particular take on it. Besides, it's also not quite accurate to see sheep as stupid, given what John 10 tells us about sheep. Because the gospel reading indicates that sheep actually have some sheep smarts. Now, our first reading is from Acts 2. As I mentioned before, we're told that the disciples have built an alternative community, a community that is fundamentally opposed to the empire and how it dominates people. Folks have sold all their possessions and are living together, sharing everything. They enjoy abundant life because they are in community. They are taking care of each other. People outside are drawn in because they see how this community cares for its own. Notice that there are no individual converts. Rather, people are joining the community in groups. Now, I should clarify something here. Most scholars doubt the historicity of the book of Acts. Luke, Acts, the originally was one book, was written quite a few decades after the events it describes. And I don't know about you, but it sounds like it's a little idealized, perhaps. It's written to emphasize a particular theology rather than to be historical. But I would urge us to focus on the key point here, that abundance comes from living in community, and that caring for each other is the basis of that community. Now, our next reading from 1 Peter 2, you might have sensed this is one that requires quite a bit of context. And in fact, before I go on much further, let me add verse 18, which is at the front of the passage we read, which was not included in the lectionary reading. Verse 18 says, "Slaves, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are dishonest." This is a challenging passage. It's not just about slaves obeying masters, but telling folks that suffering, being beaten for doing what's right, is commendable before God. This text has been used to keep people in abusive relationships. It has been used to justify slavery. Jesus' suffering and death is lifted up as a model for the audience of 1 Peter to imitate. But again, context is very important here. Because first, it sounds like this is a community that is under threat. The author devotes quite a bit of ink to encouraging this community in the face of hardship. And second, these folks weren't affluent members of the community. They were in so many ways on the fringes of society. They didn't have resources to stand up to the powers that be. And third, the Roman Empire cannot be counted on to respect the rights of fringe groups. They were always quick to suppress anything they saw as remotely subversive. So one of the commentators I was listening to described this passage as, quote, survival by any means necessary. Because that's how a small, vulnerable community survives in the midst of a brutal empire. They keep their head down and they endure. Think back to what you've heard about African Americans living under slavery in the United States before the Civil War. Or think back to what you've heard about people of faith living under oppressive governments in the 20th century. Under those circumstances, you do what you need to do to survive. So we shouldn't see this passage as a timeless commandment to always be followed. Because we don't live under those circumstances, not even remotely. Because I know that no matter what I say here this morning, I can go home to my house afterwards and possibly take a nap. I won't confirm or deny that. The secret police will not be waiting to arrest me and cart me off to prison or worse. And not only do I have protected speech, but as a citizen of a democracy, I can vote and advocate for change. But that hasn't always been the case for people of faith, nor is it the case for all people of faith now. So remember, this passage, when you read it, it's harsh, it's troubling, but that's because it's about survival in a rough time for the community. Survival by any means necessary. And our reading from John chapter 10 continues Jesus' discourse about the man born blind way back in chapter 9. Do you remember that when we talked about that? Just nod your head and say yes. It makes the preacher feel better if I believe that you remember. And that's one of the things that's so easy with the Gospel of John to lose track of, because John has these very long speeches that go on over multiple chapters. But that whole thing about the Good Shepherd actually is initiated by the conversation about the man born blind that Jesus heals. Because the language about the Good Shepherd shows why Jesus sought out the man born blind, why Jesus gave him a home even after he was expelled by the religious authorities. So it all does tie together. It's just a little hard to keep track of that sometimes. But okay, so I said something earlier about sheep not being dumb, and I know that's what you're all really interested in, because agriculture is kind of a big deal for all of you. But I'm just kidding. But one of the commentators that I was consulting about this passage mentioned that sheep are what she called sheep smart. So what are we talking about here? Well, when Jesus likens himself to the Good Shepherd, notice that Jesus says the sheep know his voice and the sheep follow him. The sheep run from the voice of the stranger, and the sheep don't listen to thieves and to bandits. This passage, it gets a little messy because we have several metaphors going on here at the same time, and they're kind of overlapping. Jesus starts out referring to himself as a shepherd, but when the disciples don't get that, he starts likening himself to a gate. But then there's also a gatekeeper in there, and that gets really, really confusing. But we're told that the sheep listen to the shepherd's voice, and that the sheep enter and exit the fold through the gate. The sheep recognize the kindness of the shepherd, hence why they run from a stranger and they don't listen to thieves and bandits. The sheep also see the results of following the shepherd, since they are able to come in and out, but also find pasture. These are real sheep smarts we're talking about here, people. These freaking Einsteins of the animal kingdom. So let me summarize a little bit what I've been talking about here so far. Our reading from Acts talks about the importance of community built on taking care of each other. The 1 Peter passage emphasizes the need for community to survive, even in difficult and oppressive situations. And the John text talks about Jesus and how he cares for his followers like a shepherd cares for his flock of sheep. Lots of good material here, probably several sermons worth actually. But I do want to go into a little bit of a different direction. Amy Leach, in her piece in the Christian Century where she was talking about this passage, she's the one who used the term sheep smart, which I really thought was kind of a cool phrase. I figure if I use that phrase, you guys will remember that. Years later, you will remember sheep smart. You may not remember what this passage was about or even any other point. Maybe not even remember I was the one that gave the sermon, but you'll remember sheep smart. And sure, we like to make fun of sheep for their supposed lack of intelligence. But in our gospel reading, we see that sheep know their shepherd by voice. And they know that they can trust him. Because sheep, it turns out, can tell the difference between kindness and cruelty, which we humans seem to have difficulty with that. Now, the sheep don't seem to have difficulty with that, but we humans, sometimes we do. Because when we're looking for leaders or trying to be good leaders, we need to keep that in mind. Be kind, not cruel. Be sheep smart. When you're choosing leaders to follow, do they lift up the lowly or do they blame them? When you're exercising leadership, what do you do? The Good Shepherd's actions don't just protect the vulnerable, they provide a space for abundant living. Sheep smarts know that. There are those who pretend to care, but Jesus tells us that they're thieves and they're bandits. They really just want what's best for them. Well, sheep smarts know that. Life is better when you're part of a flock. And not just any flock, but a flock that takes care of each other. Well, sheep smarts know that too. Be sheep smart. And that's hard to say, sheep smart. So when you go out this week, I want you to be thinking about how to be sheep smart. Sheep aren't just dumb animals. They know the voice of their master. They know the voice of the shepherd. Because they can tell the difference between kindness and cruelty. Sometimes we have trouble with that part. And if you don't like the analogy of sheep, think about your dog. In one of the texts I was reading, it mentioned that when a person from the shelter was coming to check out a home to see if they were a place where she could put a dog, she watched to see how the other dogs reacted that were already in that house. When somebody came to the door, when the master of the house was coming back, was the dog happy or not? Because dogs also can tell the difference between kindness and cruelty. So let's be sheep smart, but if you don't like sheep smart, we'll go for dog smart, okay? Live for kindness. Don't be cruel. And when you're looking to leaders in this world, expect kindness. Choose leaders for kindness, not cruelty. And whatever you do, stick together in the community, because that's where we find abundant life. Amen. Amen.